We're live.
We're live. Episode 7.
Turning the Page Women Who Shaped Our Literary Journeys.
Oh, this is going to be good.
We wanted to share a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt. The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams.
That is so fitting for today's episode because we are focusing on all things women, being Women's History Month. This is a huge one for me, and it just might be my favorite so far because I'm a huge advocate for women's empowerment and all things women, as some of you may know or may not know. I thought it would be an awesome idea to do this episode where we spotlight women who have changed reading for us one page at a time. These women have challenged the norms, inspired generations, and given voice to experiences that demand to be seen. Whether it was a novel that made you feel seen or a memoir that made you regain your strength, we're exploring the literary works that have shaped our reading. We would be here all day if we focus on every work of literature crafted by women. So I thought it would be more unique to add our spin on these phenomenal women who have shaped our journeys.
Just to piggyback on that, this is a list of some of our favorites that we've encountered along our reading journeys. It's going to be about discovering what we like, what we don't like, the kind of stories that we gravitate towards, the kind of voices that we want to hear in our lives. So this is not a definitive list of every piece of female literature out there. It's what we've encountered and what we gravitate towards. I also want to take the time to say this is Women's History Month. This focuses on the quote unquote female identifiers. And I know that a lot of authors and a lot of people in general just don't identify in one way or another. They're not binary. They're gender fluid. They're other branches of the spectrum. So we want to state, just because they're featured on this list, we do not wish to offend anybody who does not identify as quote unquote female, but we do want to recognize the works that we have found from those folks.
That's important. So I think it's very important that I mention that my reading journey started with nonfiction. And that is something that a lot of people steer away from. But back in like 2015, 2016, just when I'm like in college and trying to figure out what I wanted to do and be, I actually started reading Jen Sincero, You Are a Badass. So it was the very first book that I read, and something just sparked. Ever since I read that first book, and yes, I did read the whole series. I think there's like 3 books. Ever since I read that one, I just had to continue to read more. So after that, I read Joyce Meyer, Do It Afraid, which was actually my very first book that I got from the Woman Evolve book club with Sarah Jake Roberts. And it definitely inspired me to make the leap into creating Her Humble Pen. It was just something about that book. You see a lot of Joyce Meyer books, but I never thought that I would actually pick up and read it and be inspired. So I think it's very important to mention those 2. And then also Tabitha Brown, Feeding the Soul was another book that I did kind of stumble upon. And who doesn't love Auntie Tab? I mean, come on. It was something about Feeding the Soul that was a breath of fresh air for me. It was the one book that I read that helped me heal with Dad's transitioning and his passing. So that was just the one that I feel like I have to read it every year. It's just beautiful. Just literally feeding the soul, which is something that is important for us to do.
Yeah, you talked about that in the grief episode.
Yes. I feel like these are my top 3 books. Then my professional journey, I was introduced to Brené Brown. I think a lot of people known her for her works Dare to Lead, Gift of Imperfection, and Daring Greatly. While I was doing my research and some of these authors that have shaped my reading journey, I want to mention that Brené Brown in particular has spent the past 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And these are things that a lot of people do not touch on, but they're so important. Then the last 3 that I have on here for my nonfiction space, I'm gonna leave it at these last 3. I have Sarah Jake Roberts, Woman Evolve and Power Moves. Phenomenal reads, very phenomenal. Brianna Wiest, The Mountain Is You. It is the one book that I have found that talks about self-sabotage and how you can't go anywhere because you are your own mountain. Very powerful. And then last but not least, again, these are all in no certain order or anything, but Viola Davis, Finding Me. That book was powerful. I read it probably 2 years ago. Phenomenal.
Yeah, we talked about that offline, but that is the one memoir that I keep eyeing that I know I want to read. A memoir is such a hard sell for me. You're going to find out because I have all of one book on here.
That's okay, you're gonna add more.
Yeah, so that was in our goals. We talked about our 2025 reading goals, and I want to do more nonfiction, not necessarily memoirs. I don't gravitate towards celebrity culture. So memoirs aren't a thing for me. Not that all memoirs are celebrities, but they are people that are known for something. And I want to pick that one up because I've seen some documentaries and like little articles and pieces regarding Viola and her relationship with her best friend,
Mhm.
who she really credits towards keeping her on path to where she is now. And
Absolutely.
they've been friends for 40 years. That is such a powerful story. And they remind me of dynamics between some of the people that I grew up with that I wish my friendship had lasted 40 years
Mhm.
because I remember how we leaned on each other and relied on each other the whole way. So I do want to pick up Viola Davis's Finding Me and find other nonfiction books. I have some that are like business related and self help related. I
Mhm.
don't gravitate a lot towards those. I'm going to have to find ones that help me reflect in a useful way, but I don't want to spend a week reading a nonfiction book. It's a strange balance of investment for me
Mhm.
that is going to be hard to get, but I am committed to finding something on this reading journey as we develop and find out about ourselves what nonfiction I gravitate towards.
Oh, I got a couple I'm gonna share with you.
I'm sure you do. My one nonfiction on here is Jeanette McCurdy. I'm glad my mom died. This was everywhere. I want to say 2021. She really blew up. This book, I found it on Instagram, Bookstagram, because she was promoting it. Everybody was talking about it, giving it top rankings. And I'm like, I just got to find out. What is this book about? Reading through it, there is a lot of body shaming, certainly bits that feel like grooming and other inappropriateness, not just from her mother, but from people, executives, and things like that. Jeanette, of course, was on Nickelodeon for a long time, and we know the scandal that Nickelodeon and Dan Schneider are involved in. And while nobody is really mentioned by name, it was interesting to see some of the people that I watched growing up and, as a young adult and hear the stories and how they affected one person's life. You think it's nothing, but you don't realize how much damage your words and actions are doing to one person.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed watching her. She was funny. And then she just disappeared. And
Mhm.
now we know why. So I cannot recommend that one enough. It is hard, especially for those who have lost a parent, but I don't want to try and downplay it, but some people just aren't great people. That doesn't mean that you don't love them, but her relationship with her mother was complicated. And it was interesting to read from that perspective. Okay, so I wanted to kick this off by talking about my favorite female authors. And when I say this, this isn't like I haven't read from a lot of female writers or a lot of female perspectives. However, there are some that just really stick with me in the fiction category. So I'm going to start off with Shauna McGuire. I'm going to start off with Shauna because she also writes by Mira Grant. I've talked about this before. But as I was going through my Goodreads doing research for this, I found out I've read 17 books from this author.
Oh, wow, 17?
17 is a lot of
Mhm.
books. Now, granted, there's a novella series. Each one is less than 200 pages, but there are 10 of them. So the other seven, I have the Wayward Children series, which is the 10 book novella, young adult. Such an incredible world building there. Each child finds a door, and this door takes them away to another world. And they find the door when they need it. However, on every door is written, be sure.
Mm.
Because the second you're no longer sure, the world will kick you out. A lot of times the children are called to these doors because those worlds need heroes. And they're heroes in the non-traditional sense. The most recent book, The Girl's Missing an Arm. Of course, it follows her journey in a Russian orphanage because her parents gave her up because they didn't want an armless child.
Mm.
And she coped with all of that. And she didn't understand why these adults kept telling her that she was broken. She never had an arm to miss, and she did just fine. And there was so much power in that in her story. It wasn't a 5-star read for me, but she writes characters so well. And the world that she ended up in was a really interesting world. It was below the ocean. There
Oh,
were levels of water. So you can completely breathe in this, but if you go too low, you are not capable of breathing or standing the pressure there. But if you go above into the lakes above the ocean, it's like you're above land, but you're still underwater. It was really, really cool.
oh, that sounds really cool.
And then after that, I did the Newsflesh trilogy, which was zombies and bloggers and politics. It was so unique. I've never seen another book like it. She wrote the end of the world in such a interesting way and included science and politics and so many other things. That series was perfect. 3 stories. There's some pieces in between, some books in between. I didn't read those, but I loved that one. And then lastly, I did the Alchemical Journey series. That is middle game and that whole series. However, I didn't finish the 3rd book yet, but that one has my all-time favorite characters in any series, which are Roger and Dodger. They are so spunky, just so spunky. And I love a spunky character. And they're highly intelligent and written with such confidence. I wish I had that much confidence as a kid. It's just so cool. You got to check those out. She definitely goes in my top list as my top female author of all time, followed by these other ones, which would be Martha Wells. And I've talked about Martha recently because the Murderbot series I
Mhm.
stumbled upon a month and a half ago, and I'm about to read the 5th book this month. I'm absolutely in love with it. The way she writes Murderbot and his character and the humanization of non-human life forms is so cool. I love that perspective. I love a sentient, inanimate object that has, a heart. And Murderbot is full of action and violence, and it's so good. It's just so, so, so good. I do have another book that I just put down from this author, The Witch King. It's more traditional fantasy. I didn't have any of those characters that I was really connecting with. And after coming off of the Murderbot high, it was too different. So I sat it down, but I'm going to pick it back up. I would not hesitate to include Martha in my list of top authors who write in this space. All right, I got 2 more in my top list. Kelly Barnhill. I stumbled upon Kelly because I loved this book of the month cover for When Women Were Dragons. I was so excited for this book, and it delivered. I begged our book club to pick this book this month. We did not, but I definitely am going to want you to read this book because I think there's something so unique about it that you're going to love, because essentially what happens is sometime during the 50s, there is an event in which all women start transforming into dragons. There's this whole dynamic that follows after that. And there's the perspective of this little girl and her aunt and her mother, and how they are trying to shield and protect her while protecting that bit of her. Like one day she will become a dragon as well.
Oh, that's
And
cool.
we can't let the world steal that ability from our little girls. And it's so good.
When I was scrolling on Fable this morning, that was one of the books that someone was reading. And I was like, oh, that's the cover. So, yes, I did mark it as want to read and maybe read it in May.
I think that's a good time. It's got flowers on the cover. May flowers, right? April showers bring May flowers. I had to think about it. It's been a couple decades since I had to say that. But yeah, I definitely think you're going to like that. And then I picked up actually a YA book from her called The Girl Who Drank the Moon. It's magical and whimsical and fairy tale, and it deals with witches, and it's got a lot of that undertone talking about the strength of girls.
Mm.
And I'm a sucker. I've got Sophie's at home, my
Mhm.
little girl, and she's absolutely a dragon. But protecting that innocence and protecting our girls is just so important. And I love reading from that perspective. So 5 stars, 5 stars. The last book I picked up was just a little novella by her, and it's called The Crane Husband. And it's this retelling of a folklore story in which the husband comes home and he slowly starts to turn into this crane. It's hard to describe because it's too little to give too much away from it,
Mhm.
but it definitely talks about the dynamic of a relationship and this give and take and kind of flying off and being free. It is so good. So that's the third book I read from this author, and I gave them all 5 stars. There's no way I couldn't put her on this list.
Absolutely.
Lastly, I've only read in this one universe, but the second I say Alice Oseman, the world is going to erupt because
Mhm.
Heartstopper took the world by storm. And why Heartstopper is so important to me is because it allowed me to realize, like, hey, I enjoy reading from this queer perspective, and I should not carry shame in enjoying these stories and loving the love that's displayed here. I started reading Heartstopper. I watched the show. I reread it frequently because there's something that makes me feel so good about Nick and Charlie. It's not a romance in the traditional sense, especially from a teen perspective. It's not focused on sex. It's not focused on that physical connection in that way. It's truly the connection of the soul and the heart. And I love Nick and Charlie and every piece of that story. But then you get these other side stories that you become invested in. His sister Tori, Charlie himself and his struggles with anorexia and bulimia
Oh,
and,
wow.
body imaging.
Mhm.
And Nick is bisexual. We don't get bisexual rep in like anything because it's an enigma, even in the queer community. It's really difficult to write that down. We have a trans character,
Oh, wow.
a cis character who's in love with the trans character, and they grew up as friends, 2 boys. Now she's transitioned to a female and he still loves her. We have an ace character, asexual. We have the whole spectrum. We have a neurodivergent, autistic character, and everybody deserves love. That is the moral of Alice Oseman's story. Everybody deserves representation and love. So Alice goes on my list.
It definitely sounds like the title was perfect for it, Heartstopper,
It
because
absolutely
literally
is.
everything you just said, I was like, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Okay."
I want to watch it and read it again. Emily will just go through a period where she'll rewatch this season, especially season 3. It was really good, and she'll watch it over and over again.
That's awesome. All right, well, you have quite the list. I struggled putting this together and trying to figure out my favorite female authors because I realized that I read a lot more female authors than I thought I did. I have 3 that really stand out to me. I feel like I talk about them every episode. Our listeners are probably like, "Here she goes again." But,
You're
you know
nothing if not consistent.
right, exactly. I mean, Kristen Hanna. We cannot not mention Kristen Hanna. Yes, my favorite was The Women last year. It was my first by her. I recently just finished The Nightingale last weekend. Amazing read. I did not realize that the context of the book actually dealt with World War II. I'm not a history buff. I just need to let that be known. I am not a history buff at all. But I did not realize that this book also included the journey of the women that dealt with their husbands going away for the war. It was also about the Nazis and how they were trying to single out all the Jews. I did not realize that that was actually a part of The Nightingale. Beautiful story.
I,
Caleb will be reading it soon.
I will be reading it soon. I also want to state that really ties in well with When Women Were Dragons
Mhm.
because what happened in World War II was that men went away for the
Mhm.
Great War. Women had to step up and do those jobs.
Exactly.
That's what kicked off the transformation into dragons in that book. So it's post World War II, but it
Mhm.
almost lines up right there. So I think it's a really cool tie-in.
I might have to move that one up then. The next one I'll mention is Vanessa Miller, who again, I've mentioned probably every episode since we have started recording, but The American Queen, amazing. Just, I never knew the Happy Land existed. That's something we're not taught in school growing up, even though we're from Oberlin. I've never heard of the Happy Land. I'm not going to go into too many details on that one, but awesome story. I am currently reading The Filling Station, which was my advanced reader copy that I received a few months ago. It actually releases on Tuesday, and so far, so good. It's about the Tulsa Massacre. Then we have another one that I read called Something Good. That one was in the fall of last year that she wrote. I think it's important for me to mention that she started off in Christian fiction. She has a lot of different novels that she has written, but now she's writing historical fiction. So I'm pretty sure I will be picking up some of her other novels. And then, of course, I feel like this might be a last, but save the best for last. I don't know. I love stories. I love Kennedy Ryan. I have to make mention of the Skyland series and Real. So before I let go, This Could Be Us and Can't Get Enough that comes out on May 13th. And just the recent one that I read in February, Real, which is just that Hollywood love story. It was amazing.
And that's what we talked about before, on our reading journeys, discovering what we like, the kind of stories we like. We don't like smut here on the Bookish Buzz podcast.
No, we
We
don't.
don't shame you. You read that smut because the world is trash and you read what makes you happy.
Exactly.
But we love a love story. Something Emily was reading excerpts from Before I Let Go,
Oh my
and
goodness.
the tender love felt so real because, like, I see that in our relationship. You can see it in the relationships you've had in the past, and you're like, they appreciate the things. And by reading it, hopefully it can help you illuminate, like, I have these things in my life I need to appreciate before they're taken,
Yeah.
before we fall apart. And that's a scary thought, but you have to take time to appreciate things. She was reading and crying and laughing and crying. It was a very good book. And she thinks that's her gateway into contemporary
Oh
is
my
Kennedy
goodness.
Ryan.
Kennedy Ryan is just amazing. She's got different ones and she's got a whole realm of different books. All of them are romances. And I haven't read the others, but these that I've read so far have definitely just stuck with me.
I think I'm going to read Before I Let Go at some point because you guys are hyping it up too much.
Oh, I boohooed. We know that I have a struggle with boohooing when I read books, but that one, I totally boohooed. I loved it.
I'll get to it. I think that's what this podcast does in such great ways. These are not books I would ever consider
Mhm.
picking up, but I'm excited to read them. A lot of times we read books because they're popular. These are stories that everybody has a story to tell that is going to be felt by the world. And I think those are the things that we miss, those impactful reads. And I think that while this isn't going to change the world, I think
Mhm.
it can change a lot of people's lives by just illuminating the realness, the world we live in.
Absolutely, because I will say that I don't think any of the books that I've been reading recently have been like the hype of reading because it's on BookTube or TikTok or anything like that. It's honestly because whatever is in that book or usually that cover just somehow gravitates to me. And I'm like, I feel like that book is calling me. It's just something about that book. It's currently just calling me. And that's the one that I'm currently reading now.
I love the different ways book covers call us because you're like, "Ooh, I wanna read that one," and the title was really cool,
Uh huh.
but there was nothing about that book that would have taken my eye.
No.
But you are gravitate towards those. I gravitate towards more of those artistic
Mm,
covers that just like, I don't know, it could be the use of color or whatever, but a lot of times the books that you gravitate towards are very simple. They have an artistic quality to them, and the soul of a book calls to your soul, so you gotta pick them up when they tell you to pick them up.
exactly. The joys of mood reading.
Mood reading is the bane of my existence and the apple of my eye because I love mood reading,
Mm,
but I also think mood reading betrays me. I think I want to read books because I want to read these books, but then my heart's like, no, you
mm-mm.
don't.
Not time.
Not right now.
Yep.
All right. So I wanted to talk about a few authors that I think could have ended up on my top list and probably one day will. They're going to be my runner ups, my honorable mentions, where I've read some content from them, just not a whole lot of content, or they're just not in that perfect realm where I haven't had a miss from them. Not that I haven't had misses from like Shauna McGuire, but I keep picking them up because there's something about her writing. So I'm thinking of like T. Kingfisher. I crap talked people so much on this author because I'm like, why are you featuring this author as your favorite author of all time? I've read their horror books and I didn't like it because she writes these quirky characters almost like in a neurodivergent way. And I love that, but it is out of place in horror. It feels weird. And so I wanted to say, let me give her a third chance. And when I did, I picked up Thornhedge. It's a fairy tale retelling, and it just clicked. I completely see how her quirky way of writing characters can work really well in this kind of writing. So then I picked up Nettle and Bone, another 4-star. And then I picked up her newest book a couple of months ago called A Sorceress Comes to Call, and another 4-star. So I found what works for me with this author. I had some pretty middle of the road ratings on her horror. I liked the premise, didn't like all the characters, but these fairy tale retellings and these fantasy retellings are so good. Definitely going to end up in my top list at some point, as long as she keeps putting out that content. And then I have authors like V.E. Schwab. And Addie LaRue is in my top 5 books, maybe top 3 books of all time, because I love the way that she wrote this love story, this enduring love story that spans across hundreds of years.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed that one. It was one of the first reads I had when I got back into reading, right when I got Book of the Month. And that was my Book of the Month pick that had won Book of the Year for that year. So I picked it up and I was just in love with that book. I recommended it to people and people were loving it. And I was like, this is what reading can be. You can really find a story that just hits. But V.E. Schwab has range. She wrote Addie LaRue and has never written anything like it again.
Addie LaRue was really just a work of art. It was literally a work of art. I enjoyed it.
She's written other books that are like fantasy or a couple other standalones in magical realism. So there's one called The Near Witch, and I had a good time with that one. And Galliant, I liked that one. I even voted for it on Goodreads Book of the Year for that section. I think it was really good. And the Shades of Magic series, I only read the first book, but there's 3 books, and then there's another trilogy that follows up after that that's connected. And I haven't continued on, but I had such a good time. And they're all unique. They didn't give me Addie LaRue vibes because they're so different. She has that other book coming out here in June, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil. And I think this might be, as much as it's not like Addie LaRue, as much as it is historical, we've got 3 different timelines. Like, that's giving me Addie LaRue vibes. I'm pretty sure it's got vampires. So that, I think, is going to take it to a new level. And while I don't think we're ever going to see an Addie LaRue follow-up or an Addie LaRue type story, I think we can get the pieces that we loved from Addie LaRue in other books. And I'm hoping this will be the one. And then I have a couple others that I'm going to mention. Janot Black is actually a pair of writers who write these cozy mystery books. This is the kind of book that I say got me into really enjoying cozy mysteries. Legends and Lattes was cozy fantasy for sure. But you give me a cozy murder mystery with woodland creatures, you got a fox. I got Zootopia vibes for sure. She ends up dating the polar bear police chief. It's just so cute. And there's dozens of characters, so many characters to keep straight. But I'm on the 5th book I've already finished, and I'm pretty sure I know all of the characters. And every time they introduce other ones, you can see how they connect. And I'm like, how are we going to keep having murders happen in this tiny little town? But they do a good job with it where it doesn't feel like it's drying up. I'm putting consistently 4 stars on these books, 5 stars on these books. I'm having a good time. So I want to mention that. While I don't know if they're writing under their own names in other content, this is the only content I've read from them, but I love it. And I look forward to the next book coming out, hopefully this year. Rivers Solomon. I just finished up Model Home, and that one was a little more of a tough read for me. I didn't connect with it as much as I wanted to, but Rivers writes horror in such a very interesting space. It deals a lot with gender, and they are gender fluid themselves. So just that perspective and that representation doesn't get done. It's also Black horror and a lot to do with that Tananarive historical presence.
You've mentioned River Solomon a few other times before.
I think Sorrow Land is going to be the one. That was my 5-star that was horror, but it's not like a jump scary horror. So I think it's unsettling, but what's unsettling is no different than reading about the Tulsa Massacre and how awful that is, and experimentation on the Tuskegee Airmen. Those types of things are horrific. And writing from that perspective to tell that story in a unique way is what Rivers does so well. So Sorrowland, I think you need to pick that up in the fall.
I feel like it might be waiting in my Libby right now.
Oh, even better. You might get this sooner than later. Lastly, is actually one I know we've talked about in the past, and it feels weird to be putting this author on a list of favorite authors because they've only written one series and I've only read two of the books. However, Tommy Adeyemi has written such an impactful series where it's already got a movie deal to be transformed into a movie, I believe, for Netflix. There's something about the story she's selling, African inspired, like no other, like N.K. Jemisin vibes, where it's that African inspired, it's
Mhm.
a unique story that's not being done anywhere else. You can only read so much about fairies and elves before we want to read about these other unique perspectives. I definitely think that she will continue to write books outside of the Legacy of Orisha series, and I know I will pick them up and have a great time.
I would love to see what else she is working on because that story has very much stuck with me. I have only read the first one because I haven't picked up the other 2 yet. I like to space out my reads. I don't like to binge read a series all at once. So I did read The Children of Blood and Bone sometime last year. I know it's one that I'm going to enjoy. I wanna know what else she's working on.
I can't find any breadcrumbs on what she's got
Nothing.
coming. I think she's focused right now on making sure this show
Mhm.
goes well. The third book only came out last year in March or April. She's still finishing up that series, but I'm ready. I haven't even finished that book. I haven't even started that book, but I'm ready for another series from this author. She writes, I'd like to see a little more adult. I've seen some character progression from the first book, the second to the third, but I want to see what she can do with an adult series. And maybe not fantasy. I don't know where she's going to go, but she's got the chops to do it.
Absolutely. I agree. And speaking of powerful, I'll just add Alice Walker. For me, with The Color Purple, I feel like that is just not only a movie that everyone talks about, but it's a novel of resilience, sisterhood, and finding your voice in a world determined to silence it. I grew up watching this movie. My cousin and I used to watch it all the time, and I just loved that they redid it in the way that they did recently back in 2013. It had Fantasia and Oprah and just everybody in it, and I like that they put the musical spin on it. So everyone thought that they were gonna put their own spin on the original movie, but they made it a musical, and it was amazing. The next one that I will also add is Mary Monroe. I started reading Mary Monroe, I feel like I was 10 years old, maybe reading her books. I remember my mother was always giving me books to read as I was growing up, and I thank her so much to this day now, and she's like, "There you go with your book." She definitely just bought a Kindle Color, I will mention that as well. But she's always passing me books and telling me to read different ones, and the Mary Monroe series, God Don't Like Ugly, that's what it was. They actually titled it God Don't Like, and there's, like, 7 different books just in that one series. I mean, just the way that the book is written, the series, the characters that you pretty much just grow to love and live, it was just beautiful. Upon actually coming across Mary Monroe, because I was going through my Goodreads profile, I discovered that she is the 3rd child of Alabama sharecroppers and the first and only member of her family to finish high school. She was self-taught and started writing at 4. I was like, "How do you start writing at 4?" The first novel that she wrote was The Upper Room in 1985, which is a very popular book. I wanted to give this spotlight to Monroe because after 15 years of rejection, she finally released the God Don't Like series in 2000. Most of her work is autobiographical and inspired by recent events. She has 47 novels in her Goodreads profile. And it's not just this one series. There's several different series, and she is one that I feel that I just needed to make sure that I added on here.
That's incredible. I'm reminded of James Baldwin because he writes semi autobiographical.
Mhm.
And that I did try Go Tell It on the Mountain. I did not get to it. The mood was not mooding. I could not do it. However, I can see some of the things where
Mhm.
James wrote these books that were known in the literary field as
Mhm.
incredible. Mainstream rejected it.
Mhm.
because it told the stories that the world didn't want to hear. And
Yeah.
now we look back on these folks and celebrate their works. And
Yeah.
Mary Monroe is not one that I've ever heard of. Reading about what you've written here is incredible
Oh,
and
I was amazed
inspiring.
reading it. I was like, "Oh, I didn't know this." I just thought it was amazing because, you hear about women writing, but you don't really hear about women authors. They're there, but they deserve to be spotlighted. And I was just like, I need to share.
I love it. And the next author we're going to talk about is going to get a lengthy section due to their roots here in Lorraine, but I'll let you start that one off.
Yes. So, Toni Morrison, my goodness. Where do you begin with Toni Morrison? I will just share that my first introduction to Morrison was my mother giving me The Bluest Eye. That was my very first novel by her. I think I read it in like third or fourth grade, along with Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Funny thing, both of these books are banned now. Toni Morrison's work is not only unique, it's groundbreaking in its own way because of the stories that she did write. The other novels that I did read was Beloved, Sula, and Song of Solomon. Very popular, very great reads. I feel like every time February comes around, for Black History Month, a lot of people focus on Toni Morrison, but I feel like she just needs to be read throughout the whole year.
I've read one book from this author, and I know I need to pick up more. These are the types of impactful reads we need to be reading. Being such a local person, we're sitting inside of the Lorraine Public Library, Ohio, and Tony is from Lorraine. Tony is prolific in the area. We have posters outside on the windows. We have 4 or 5 standing informational celebrating the life of Toni Morrison pieces here in the library. And it's such an incredible thing, and I want to read more because I read Recitative and it is so incredibly powerful as a reader, as a person who's biracial who kind of toes that line between the two races, that balancing act. She wrote this book as an experiment on racial coding in writing.
Oh, wow.
And so it tells the story of a Black girl and a white girl and their dynamics, friendship, struggles, all of that. It is a short, short, short book. You can read it 100 times over and the story changes because there's no way to tell which girl is white and which girl is Black.
Oh, wow.
And I promise you, you cannot do it. You can only put your personal bias on it. There is no definitive way. Toni has now left us in 2019. She never told us in
To
her
who was
mind
who.
who was who, because I don't believe that she put her experiences in her life, I think, in both of those little girls.
I have to read that one.
It is incredible. And like as a writer, an
Mhm.
inspiring writer, I want to, and this is what James did a lot. I want to tell a story, but I want to experiment with the kind of story I want to tell. We don't get enough of that.
No.
And I want to see more of that in literature. Of course, I don't need it in my fantasy novels. I want it in
Mhm.
those literary reads. Celeste Ng reminds me a lot of that. She wrote Our Missing Hearts, which is
Mhm.
from an Asian perspective. There's something about these reads that I'm not Asian.
Mhm.
However, I feel the connection to the characters because you wrote that character so incredibly well. I want to read books like that. Tony is just incredible. I do want to pick up Beloved.
Oh,
That is one that reaches out to me, one that I think I want to tackle sometime this year when my heart can handle it.
I'm telling you, I think you could probably pick up any read by Toni Morrison and it just be a winner.
I can't wait for you to read Recitative because it is
If it's
incredible.
out in the library, I'll go pick it up now and take it home.
I think why would we skimp on these, book recs and what our experiences have been with these authors and with these stories? They deserve to be spotlighted. That's why we're doing a whole episode on this. So buckle up. We got some more. So there's some books that don't fit into the traditional top authors or top this or top that. But I do want to mention that Bloom by Delilah S. Dawson was my book of 2023. It is a little horror novella and it challenges a lot of things that women can't be serial killers, can't be monsters or this. And the two characters, it's very much this relationship between them. It is tumultuous. It is salacious. It is twisted. And I loved every single bit of it to the point that I wanted to read everything by this author. And I haven't had good luck with that. The most recent book I read that was on my top anticipated list, This Will Only Hurt for a Moment, just didn't stick. And I think it has to do with the fact that that book was long. If we look at some of the things that I tend to gravitate towards, it's the shorter stories. In the shorter stories, some of our authors can really shine. And I think that's what happened here. Bloom by Delilah is so good, but it's not one that I think is going to be for everybody. The other book I want to mention is The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. It's a Black Carrie retelling, and it is so much better than the original. I don't love Stephen King. I know that's blasphemous for a horror fan. He gets a little icky sometimes. Just don't care for him. I read a lot of his books still because I think that they're impactful into the genre, but there's always an element that just doesn't click with me. I will say there have been some that just blew me away, but in terms of Carrie, I was much more impressed by the movie than by the book. But Tiffany took that story, put a black twist on it, and absolutely killed it. That is a 5 out of 5 read. It is bloody. It is violent. It is incredible. So definitely pick up some more from Tiffany D. Jackson. I read White Smoke and one other story by that author. And yes, definitely very much racially involved. And I think those stories have merit. And I like to read from that perspective. This one, just top of the list, really blows me away.
I have a lot of different books on my list for Tiffany D. Jackson. I just haven't yet picked them up, but I see a lot of Allegedly, Grown, and then also the White Smoke that you mentioned. Like those are some of the biggest reads that you get with Tiffany Jackson. I plan to read more from her.
I think she's an emerging voice. I know she's been around for a little while, but I think she's an emerging voice in horror, especially horror from a perspective that is not traditional in the sense that it involves race or it involves urban horror, which is a very niche genre that I want to see explored more. She does a great job, especially in that dynamic of urban to suburban. That White Smoke involves a lot with that. And
Mhm,
I liked it. Kind of fell apart at the end for me. It just got a little too weird.
mm.
I think if I reread that one, I might be able to give it a better rating because I think I've read more that's kind of pushed me along due to the fact that I really enjoyed some of her other pieces and I can pick up some of the nuances that she's written. And then the last book I have is a bit of a cheat. I'm going to say that.
Mhm.
The story does not focus on women. It's actually a male-male romance, and it's a Icarus retelling. But Kay Ankrum wrote this story in such a beautiful and tender way. There's an important responsibility for authors now to retell some of these classic stories with modern twists because they're stories that have morals and values and lessons that need to be taught and learned. We're not going to be able to just sit down and read Shakespeare or Greek mythology and unless you're Emily, because that's all she reads. But no, but like that needs to be twisted and changed and remixed. And this one blew me away. Absolutely blew me away. I was, don't take much from me to cry. I was crying throughout this book, and it celebrates love and art. There's a lot to do with art. And that one I feel is going to be big, big, big in the YA space. Over the next couple years, I think Kay Ankrum, who has many more books to come out, is going to be one I gravitate towards.
That's awesome. I have just a handful more. That's one thing that I really love to hear is how different reads have shaped our journeys. I found that while looking through my list of books that I have read, thank you, Goodreads. I don't know how I would have done this without Goodreads, just being honest.
Same.
One thing that stood out to me was Sister Soldier. I remember everyone in high school was like, you got to read The Coldest Winter Ever. And I did. I just love that story. And it was like that one story just sat and like her name was Winter. Well, there's a couple of other books. I heard that book 3 was not as great, but I want to go back and reread these books because I mean, this was like, what, 2005? It's like 20 years ago or so when I've actually read those. So I want to go back to read Coldest Winter Ever. While in the Coldest Winter Ever, we were introduced to Midnight. I don't remember when Midnight was introduced, which is why I want to go back to read them. But I do remember that I was very set on reading the Midnight series. When my dad used to take us to Borders, I would make sure I went to Borders and I was like, I gotta get this next book. And he's like, you already have it. I'm like, no, it's a new one. It was just something about the writing and the work of Sister Souljah. Also, I wanna mention one of her nonfiction works, which is actually No Disrespect. Again, I love a nonfiction book, and No Disrespect was definitely a very powerful read. I mean, we cannot mention women and not mention Jodi Picoult. I mean, she has over 40 novels in her Goodreads profile. The one that I have read that stood out to me the most is My Sister's Keeper. This was another one that my mother passed to me several years ago, and it still sticks with me. I just didn't realize that the way Jodi writes her fiction is very different than a lot of the other novels we may read now. I do have 3 more on my list. Mad Honey, which actually mentions Oberlin College. I am really excited for that. I plan to read that one in August. Small Great Things in June, and By Any Other Name in May. I know I am a mood reader at heart, but I know for sure these 3 books will be read this year, somewhere within those months. And then last but not least, I have Sadiqa Johnson. Where can I even start with her 2 novels that I've read? I feel like she has a whole lot more, but these 2 just stuck with me the most. The Yellow Life was actually the telling of women who couldn't necessarily pass as white during that time, but they had that fair skin. So they weren't necessarily in the field or anything. But Sadiqa tells the story of how this lady becomes the wife of the slave owner at the time and how she actually helped prep some of the other women that came in and how these men would make these fair-skinned women their wife. Mind blowing. I never knew that story of how that went, and especially everything that they go through with their kids. Very powerful. And then last but not least, I will mention The House of Eve. This one actually mentions Illyria, and I thought that was really cool, but it talks about a period of time that you also don't hear about now either. Of course, these are both historical fiction. Sorry, not sorry. I love it. In House of Eve, it actually talks about how this young woman, I think it was high school age, she got pregnant. And at this time, they would actually send their pregnant kids away so that they're not technically shamed. And then they go to this house to live and deliver their babies, and then their babies are secretly adopted. And then they go back into this space, and then they're supposed to live their lives without their kid. Just very, very powerful. And these are things that are not taught in school. I feel like I have a calling to read more of these historical fiction books because there's so much power in these novels and it deserves a mention. So, definitely The Yellow Life and The House of Eve. If you have not read them before, I highly suggest to read those 2.
So, again, that was a lot of our fiction reads that were more focused on the content or the authors themselves. But I wanted to take a minute and celebrate some of our favorite fictional female main characters in books because I definitely have a list that if you asked me who lives rent free in your brain, I've got that list right here. And I'm going to kick it off with Gideon and Harrow from the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir. I love this series, and it definitely deserves to be mentioned on this list because Tamsin and the content is not female related, but Gideon and Harrow, though I believe Gideon is actually non binary, they're just so freaking funny and cool and badass. They're incredible. The story is not this traditional linear story. And The Locked Tomb is definitely going to be one. There's going to be the fourth book is coming out, and it better come out this year because I'm dying for it. It should be finishing out the series, but she's not done anything else. She's not written anything else. And I'm dying for this series to finish up and to get a resolution. Essentially, the series follows Gideon in the first book. Gideon is from the ninth house, which is essentially planet that surrounds this emperor's planet. And it's really difficult to explain, but I like the catchphrase. The punchline is basically it's necromancers in space. And I didn't need more than that to pick up the book. But by the end of the book, you realize how complex the story really is and how complex the world building is. And then you pick up the second book, and it's so vastly different. It doesn't just pick up where the other one left off. And the third one throws you for a loop because it's almost like you go from like this futuristic space opera style to almost like they're on Earth. And a lot of the elements that we have in modern day society seem to be in play. And you're very confused. It all comes together in the end. I think the fourth book is going to blow us away. Cannot wait. My second is going to be Galaxy Stern from Ninth House, which you'll be reading this month.
Very soon.
And she is, I use the word spunky a lot, but she doesn't give a shit about anybody's feelings. She is confident. She is powerful. She's funny. She's everything that I love in a strong, powerful female lead. And so I really enjoyed Galaxy. I love her name. It's one that I can't ever forget. So yeah, definitely check that out. Ninth House and Hellbent. And then my last one is Jade Daniels. Jade Daniels from the Angel of Indian Lake series by Stephen Graham Jones is hands down one of the best female examples of character development. She's a final girl, the one girl who always survives in a horror slasher film. And she doesn't want that identity. She doesn't think it's her. But as you follow Jade's story, she goes from this naive, horror-obsessed teen into a woman. She is put through it. Broken and bruised is not even close. She's slashed and destroyed. By the end of that third book, I was literally crying in a horror book because watching Jade come as far as she did was incredible. I want to give a shout out to that. Always root for the final girl. Jade Daniels will be rounding out my top 3.
Now, how do I put all of my favorite characters, fictional characters, into a list?
It feels like a betrayal sometimes. It does.
It feels so impossible. But honestly, as I keep thinking on who to put in my list, looking at it, it actually matches my top 3 for the year. I have Frankie from The Women, a Vietnam nurse who made sure that America was aware that women could also be heroes. And it wasn't just men. It's because nurses at that time were not honored or celebrated. The work that Hannah put into telling Frankie's story is memorable. Gosh, I read this last year and it still just sticks with me when you tell me I have to come up with 3 fictional characters. I'm like, okay, how do I find these 3? Frankie was the very first one that just popped into my mind. The second one I would have to say would be Luella from The American Queen, the first Black woman to rule on American land. I think that is power in its own deserves its own section, honestly, because that was unheard of. But she was fierce, she was strong. She kept her mind on what it was, and she says, "I'm not a slave anymore," and she made sure that everyone else knew that as well, and just defied all odds, especially during that time. And then lastly, I would have to say Isabel from The Nightingale. It's Kristen Hanna, and this might be a little spoilery. I just feel that I need to mention Isabel. She defied all odds and refused to stay home while the men went to fight. The book really focuses on her. I feel that she is the true main character and how she ended up risking her life to save these pilots from the German soldiers and return them to Spain so that they would be safe, so that they return home to their families. And Just everything that she risked, it's amazing, honestly, it is amazing, and the work that she really put into her characters was really good. I can't find anyone else necessarily to put those would have to be my top 3.
Lists are hard
They're daunting.
because they change, they grow, they
Yeah.
evolve.
I
People
think it
fall
goes
off,
with the
people add
season.
on. Well, what's top of mind right now? A lot of yours were your big reads from the last few years. That makes sense. I've read these over the last few years, but when I think like, oh, I want to recommend a series to somebody, these are the ones that come up for people.
All the time.
And it's because the characters, not necessarily just the story, but a lot of times it's the characters. And this whole series is about celebrating not only female voices on this side of the page, but within the story as well. I really wanted to take our time there. I like that. I like our list.
I think we did very well with our list. But we're not done yet. We gotta talk about poetry.
This is going to be our last section, but it's one that I think we both wanted to recognize we have some work to do.
I was like, "Man, I don't read a lot of poetry." It's just something that, like you said, it's not where you just sit down and you read a book from cover to cover. So kinda take it as you need it. Poetry is when you need it, wherever you need it, and how you need it. I think that's important. So, as you mentioned, like sitting down and having coffee or tea and reading a poem, it's just about reflection. I remember growing up that I was really, I don't want to say obsessed, but I was pretty much obsessed with Maya Angelou. Wanted to read all of her work, and I haven't read any since really, but for her, I had Phenomenal Woman, Still I Rise, and On the Pulse of Morning, which is also known as The Rock Cries Out to Us Today. Very, very powerful. I feel like they're probably her 3 that you hear the most. I did also read her autobiography when I was much younger, and it still resonates with me today. And then last but not least, I have Morgan Harper Nichols, and All Along You Were Blooming is actually one of the books that I picked up maybe like 2 years ago, but I didn't really read it. Like you said, it was just one of those ones that you pick up, and even inside this book, each stanza is on a different page, and it's just all kinds of different work throughout this book. She also has a nonfiction book, which is Pieces of Practice. That is like my whole life right now. I feel like the end goal of everything is peace, and that book is just great. I can't not mention nonfiction.
You're good. I thought I read more. I really did. I'm drawn to poetry. I love poetry. You cannot just ingest poetry because you want to. You have got to read it when you need it. And
Mhm.
now I definitely think there's something that maybe we can do a series in May, like where we just read a poem every day and we just find some poems from some authors, feature them, talk about them. I don't know, but I want to read more poetry because the
Absolutely.
two that I have on here, one I have not finished, and the other one everybody heard because everybody watched the
Oh,
the
yeah, that was a good
inauguration,
one. That was a
Amanda
good one.
Gorman. So I'm going to start with Amanda. The Hill We Climb, which was her poem for America that was performed at Joe Biden's presidential inauguration. And gosh, she's so young and so powerful. And she wields her words like a weapon in the best way. I just can't wait to read more poetry from her because I think a young Black voice is something that needs to be celebrated. We see Maya Angelou, we see Toni Morrison, we see all these giants. They didn't start that way. They were a young Black voice in America. And I want to celebrate more like that.
Mhm.
And so I also have to call out Urbanshi is the book of poetry by Ciara Freeman. And I actually was told about this poet from a coworker of mine, and they are obsessed with Ciara's poetry. She is powerful. She is a Black woman in America. Her poetry, especially the ones you can find some videos on YouTube of her doing slam poetry and some other things. Oh my gosh. She's so powerful. She controls her words in such a way. She commands her womanhood, she commands her blackness, and it is so incredible. So I do want to finish that. I've read bits and pieces of her Banshee, which is a really interesting take on kind of like retelling folk tales and mythology and putting her twist from this urban black voice growing up in America and putting that twist on there. But I can't just sit down and read it. I have to take it a little bit at a time. And so I think maybe I'm going to tackle that over the next couple months and say, I want to read these poems, but I want to take them in and maybe do some journal reflecting as I read them. And like, how did this make me feel? And what did I get out of this poem? And so on and so forth. Dara is a local author here in Cleveland. I cannot wait to see more of their work.
It sounds like we have another challenge brewing.
Hey, we got Q2 is coming up.
That might be a thing.
It might be. I don't know what we want to do yet. We haven't talked about that, but we better get talking because
It'll be
April's
here
right around the
before we know
corner.
it.
So, we wanted to celebrate these voices during Women's History Month. This is a big list here.
Mm.
After we started analyzing our reads and checking out what we have already ingested, I'm blown away by how many female authors I truly love their works. They stick out as definitive leaders in my reading history. I want the world to know. I want to push these books in your face and say, read it, read it, read it.
Yes. So everyone has to share this episode with everyone because these are some powerful reads that we have in here.
And, Women's History Month ends at the end of March. Celebrating female voices does not.
No.
Just like Black History Month is not 28 days.
Oh.
We celebrate Black voices. We celebrate female voices. We celebrate the voices that mean something to us, that have a story to tell. And that's the best part of reading. So I cannot wait for our next exploration. I don't know what theme we're going to do next month, but this one was a lot of fun.
This definitely was a lot of fun and a great moment of reflection, honestly, I think, for the both of us. I just can't wait to see where this goes.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's going to wrap us up for today. And so until the next episode, we're going to say
Happy reading.
bye.